Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you today to our Alba webinar series, Breaking Down the Ivory Tower. First, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Alba. So the Alba Network was created to promote equity and diversity in the brain sciences. So the goals of Alba are to recognize implicit bias and discrimination and to provide better visibility as well as professional development opportunities to scientists from underrepresented groups in brain research. So the Alba Network is now boasting more than 2,000 members from 91 countries, and it keeps growing every day. So if you'd like to get involved or simply support the cause, you can become an Alba member. It's free to sign up. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit or highlight some of our activities, we highlight diverse scientists through interviews. We have webinars discussing EDI issues, awards, mentoring sessions, and networking events. And we provide a platform to disseminate data as well as best practices towards creating more inclusive brain research communities. You can visit our activities and resources page on the Alba website to learn more. A pillar of Alba's actions is the Alba Declaration. So it's a resource for concrete, positive, evidence-based actions that individuals and organizations can, at any level, can take to promote equity and inclusivity. So I invite you to read through this and sign it. And we'd like to thank our many sponsors from around the world that support our activities. So just to tell you a little bit about the Alba Disability and Accessibility Working Group. So we're running today's webinar, and we were created around 2 years ago. So this was really a kind of grassroots initiative. So some Alba members with disabilities we decided that this would be a really great thing to have. And because it's been very grassroots, we've actually developed a lot of our own initiatives and ideas. And so one of those that we had recently was to create a series of short videos that provided tips to make neuroscience more accessible to researchers with disabilities. So you can find these tips and videos on Alba's YouTube channel. So just follow Alba and social media. Okay, so turning to today's webinar series. This series aims to bring down the ivory tower of ableism within the brain research community, one extraordinary neuroscientist at a time. So these webinars give a platform to scientists with disabilities from across the globe and across all aspects of neuroscience, a chance to kind of reflect on and discuss ways in how one can promote a more inclusive working environment and accessibility to research. So each episode covers a different perspective on challenges faced by disabled scientists. So today we're very excited to have Bethan Burnside joining us. They are a passionate science communicator, a member of the Inclusion and Diversity Committee at the Leuven Brain Institute, and they're involved in various art science initiatives, such as NeuroArt. So today they're going to tell us about their experiences as a neurodivergent neuroscientist. So take it away, Bethan.
Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay? All good? Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be invited to speak with the Alba network and to give a talk about my lived experience of being a neurodivergent person working in neuroscience. So today I want to share a little bit about my story, about my experience of navigating barriers to inclusion in academia, how I've somewhat harnessed my perspective to inform my science communication practice, and also a bit about my journey in fostering a sense of neuroqueer pride as well. My aim for this talk is that people who either identify as neurodivergent or who are questioning whether they might identify as neurodivergent might recognize themselves in my story, and that people who don't might learn something about this lived experience in order to become better managers, employers, colleagues, and allies. I did just want to add a disclaimer on two fronts before we get into it. So for one, even though I do have an early career stage background in mental health and neuroscientific research, I do not consider myself an academic expert on any of these topics I'll be covering today. So today I'm speaking as a lived experience expert. So in other words, from the unique expertise of someone who lives as a neurodivergent person day by day. And my second disclaimer is the acknowledgement that while I will be speaking from the truth of my own personal experience, this experience will by no means reflect the opinions, perspectives, preferred language, or reality of every neurodivergent person, only my own. So without further ado, I can't seem to move my slides around. There we go. Okay, perfect. So let me get straight into it. My lived experience of ADHD. So 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. As is in the name, and as a lot of people already know, this is a persistent pattern of inattention or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. There's 3 different subtypes of ADHD. They're predominantly inattentive presentation, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and then there's the combined, and I enjoy the experience of being a combined ADHDer. If we look at this article by Sandra Coy, who's a psychiatrist specializing in adult ADHD in the Netherlands, we see that adult ADHD is characterized by 4 main quadrants. The first is inattention and hyperfocus. This looks like getting lost sometimes in irrelevant or interesting details, attentional differences, which might make thinking or speaking a little bit more long-winded or adventurous than neurotypical people. But on the flip side, ADHDers can also over-concentrate, quote unquote, or hyperfocus. So this phenomenon mostly occurs when we are engaged in activities that we find extremely interesting. And when this happens, concentration can actually last for hours on end in a very, very focused manner. The second quadrant is hyperactivity. Hyperactivity in adults often manifests itself in feelings of continuous inner restlessness or agitation, talking too much, ceaseless mental activity, not being able to relax properly, or even needing drugs or alcohol in order to relax or to sleep. The third quadrant is impulsivity, which can have serious consequences for relationships with family, friends, colleagues, and employers. It can also seriously impact personal finance, eating behaviors, and so on. Closely related to impulsivity is sensation-seeking behaviors, where ADHDers may seek out excitement from novel or thrilling stimuli. And then the fourth is emotional dysregulation, which can manifest in things like irritability, frustration, anger, low frustration tolerance, temper outbursts, and things of that sort. So this article by Sandra Coy further breaks down these 4 quadrants into lots and lots of other little things, which I won't go into too extensively, but under inattention, things like forgetfulness, distractibility, chaotic presentation, and so on. Under hyperactivity, things like fidgeting, knocking things over because of excessive movement. The last 2 really hits home, being able to sit still. But if you do manage to sit still, this comes with a lot of muscle strain, which I'm currently going to a lot of physio for at the moment. Impulsivity, things I've mentioned already, but things like spending too much, walking out of jobs, and so on. And emotional dysregulation. So on the one hand, the ADHD diagnosis 3 years ago came a little bit as a surprise, and here's why. Because despite having completed a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in neuroscience, by the point of the diagnosis, I had fallen victim to three common myths about ADHD. Myth number one being people who are diagnosed with ADHD always do badly at school. But at the time of diagnosis, I had successfully completed 2 degrees and with incredible grades, and was doing a PhD in biomedical sciences at the time. So that was clearly not the case. Myth number two being that ADHD manifests in childhood and then goes away once an ADHD reaches adulthood. However, I was 25 years old at the time of diagnosis, and later found out that the prevalence of ADHD in adults is estimated at around 2.8%. And then the third myth is that ADHD occurs in people who are assigned male at birth, whereas I am assigned female at birth, and would later find out that sex differences in ADHD are well documented, with AFABs being less likely to be diagnosed, although maybe not less likely to experience ADHD traits. On the other hand, the ADHD diagnosis was not a surprise at all. As is the case with many adults eventually diagnosed with ADHD. It took several years before the prospect of ADHD was even put on the table. I spent the first 7 years of my adult life being treated for depression and anxiety. It was only during my master's at King's College London that their fantastic disability and inclusion support team picked up on my experience and referred me to an educational psychologist for testing. The educational psychologist was not able to give me a diagnosis per se, but they were able to observe what's called a spiky profile of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. So a spiky profile refers to the uneven or inconsistent pattern of strengths and weaknesses often experienced by neurodivergent individuals in comparison to a neurotypical profile. Of course, all people have variable skills and abilities, right, as well as challenges, but for neurodivergent people, this variation is often just more pronounced. So the educational psychologist that I saw suggested that my specific profile was often reflective of a person with ADHD characteristics, and suggested I might want to try and seek out a diagnosis if I was struggling or seeking support. I saw the educational psychologist in February 2020, so there was a little bit of a glitch, and it took a minute to get a diagnosis after that. But even without the global pandemic getting in the way, many people who finally receive an ADHD diagnosis have endured significantly long waiting periods. Last year, ADHD UK published a report demonstrating that the waiting time for an ADHD diagnosis for adults in the UK ranged from 12 weeks to 550 weeks, which is 10 years, with an average waiting period of 1 to 2 years. In order to fast track the waiting list, as I was able to, you must have the privilege of being able to afford to pay the cost of private healthcare and assessment. So, given these prevailing barriers to diagnosis, it should come as no surprise that by the time a member of the neurodivergent community receives a formal label, a common response amongst other neurodivergent people is actually congratulations, in stark contrast to reactions from neurotypical friends, family, and colleagues, which can project elements of defense and embarrassment. For example, assuring you that you don't seem that ADHD to me, or doesn't everybody have a little bit of ADHD nowadays? I hope that it also provides some context and validation to self-diagnosis. The process of diagnosing or identifying medical conditions in oneself may be supported by resources on the internet or past personal experiences, or recognizing elements of a diagnosis that a family member previously had or currently has. This is part of the reason why, as of late, I've tended to use the description neurodivergent rather than ADHD to describe myself. While I have a formal diagnosis of ADHD, I have recognizable elements of some other neurotypes, corroborated by friends and family with formal diagnoses of these neurotypes, yet I don't have the time, money, energy, or particularly the desire to have this experience backed by a medical professional at this point in time. This might change if I would like to seek medical or government support that isn't available to people diagnosed with ADHD, but is available to people diagnosed with autism, for example. So I'm coming on to part 2 of this talk on being a neurodivergent person in neuroscience specifically. So in my personal experience, my ADHD characteristics didn't present themselves as any kind of potential issue in my work life until I started working in a research environment. So during my bachelor's, I was working 40 hours a week to support myself alongside my full-time studies. Of course, I checked a lot of the criteria that I mentioned earlier, the ADHD criteria, difficulty with punctuality, difficulty relaxing, low frustration tolerance, and so on. But I pinned this down to juggling an intensive work education schedule. When it came to coursework, my adrenaline and my hyper focus would kick in. I would often start, complete, and submit the night before my deadline. I developed methods which unwittingly compensated for my memory difficulties. For example, I would print every interesting article I ever read, take physical notes, cut everything up, arrange them on my kitchen floor to make a sort of visual brain map and have all of the information in front of me. I didn't attend many of my lectures, and those I did attend, I spent the entire time reading philosophy books from the library, not entirely focusing on those either. Yet I finished my bachelor's with the highest grade in my cohort. And I had a similar experience during my master's. And just before it got to conducting an internship in the lab, COVID hit. So this gave me the time and the space to make up for the academic aspects that I found difficult. And once again, I passed my degree with flying colors. But it was once I started working in research and then subsequently started a PhD in a neurodevelopmental genetics lab where my ADHD characteristics first presented themselves as an issue in an academic or scientific work setting. Little side note that they definitely present themselves in social and other settings much earlier than this, but maybe that's a little bit outside of the scope of this talk. So imagine your distractibility, just to paint a picture of what that looked like in a neuroscientific environment, in a lab setting. Imagine your distractibility being so great that you can't see cell media or other materials that are sitting right in front of you in the fridge, for example. Or imagine your forgetfulness being so intense that you lose track of counting your samples again and again and again. Imagine working in an office environment where you are constantly fidgeting, knocking things over, talking too much, or talking too loudly. I still remember so clearly on my first day ever working in the lab, the manager of the entire department came into my office and reprimanded me for being too loud. So imagine, trying to develop good relationships with your colleagues when your impulsivity lends you to inadvertently interrupting conversations or blurting out comments that others might deem socially or professionally inappropriate. And, the list goes on and on. So during this time, which coincided with my diagnosis, I turned to the neurodivergent community for support. Thanks to Twitter and other online spaces, I started hearing about several alternative concepts and ideas from the disability and neurodiversity justice movements for the very first time, despite having been in and out of patient care and mental health services for the past 7 years. My main perception shift was learning more about the neurodiversity paradigm and understanding the difference between medical and social models of disability. So the neurodiversity paradigm is a framework for understanding human brain function that recognizes the diversity of human cognition as a biological fact. According to this perspective, diversity in human cognition is normal, and some conditions that are traditionally classified as mental or neurodevelopmental disorders are actually differences. The movement emerged in the 1980s and 90s and stems from conversations from within the neurodivergent community itself. This framework builds on what we call the social model of disability, which emphasizes that disability arises partly from societal barriers rather than completely from inherent, for example, biological and genetic deficits or differences. This is in contrast to the medical model of disability, which is traditionally more prevalent in the biomedical sciences, which perceives, in this case, that neurodiversity is a predominantly individual residing deficiency or abnormality, with the normalization or the cure of the individual as the main goal. So within this framework, I also started to learn more about accommodations and accessibility. When we talk about accommodations, we talk about reducing or eliminating barriers to inclusion upon the request of an individual. This might include, for instance, providing screen reading software or hiring a sign language interpreter for an event. Accommodations are reactive. And unfortunately, they force a person to out themselves as disabled or neurodivergent, whether they want to or not. Whereas on the flip side, accessibility is proactive, and accessible design from the get-go can also just help save time and money, all the while hopefully eliminating a person's more negative experiences. However, what I found was that for a person or for neurodivergent people in an academic setting, identifying and implementing accommodations was not as straightforward as I'd imagined it to be. I remember going to my university's accessibility department soon after getting diagnosed and was surprised to see their lack of lived experience expertise for neurodiversity and the dearth of recommendations for accommodations that could be implemented for PhD candidates specifically. So myself and some other neurodivergent PhD researchers, we banded together to collectively identify barriers and to research and brainstorm potential accommodations that we could advocate for. For instance, to tackle forgetfulness and out of sight, out of mind phenomena, we thought to ask for double screens in order to have more information in front of us and less hidden away in the tab jungle. To target a common ADHD or difficulty in pulling out stored information on demand as well. We were wanting to work towards a culture change in reading from notes during presentations, as I'm doing right now. However, before we had the chance to see these through, I actually decided to leave my PhD. So I've said this before, but I'll reiterate it again. This is my personal story. And in that, I came to the personal conclusion that the expectations demanded from research and the culture within which academics operate would not be adaptable or amenable to the extent and the pace with which I wanted to feel comfortable and thrive in my work, in my research. So very oversimply put, I made the decision to leave my PhD with the intention of finding a career path where my ADHD characteristics would work for me and not against me. At the time of quitting, I had no idea what that might look like, but I was really lucky to soon find a role as a science communicator at a neuroscience research center. For one, this gave me the chance to start with a clean slate. From my very first interview, I informed my managers to be that I identify as neurodivergent, and from the moment I started working, I let my colleagues know what it means to be ADHD and how this might change my approach to the way I work. By that point, I'd been long enough in the neurodivergent community that the way that I was armed with both the language and the confidence to communicate the way that I think, act, react, and I could ask others to support my integration into the workflow and team with ease. Similar to my experience during the bachelor's and master's, I once again found ways to not only navigate my ADHD, but in certain ways also harness my ADHD to my advantage in a work context. Unlike the day-to-day life of PhD research, which involves a lot of going in depth, the breadth of my communications role meant that I can have my fingers in 20 pies at once. I truly thrive on the novelty of no 2 days are the same, and the adrenaline rush of the fast-paced and often last-minute nature of communications. I'm still obsessed with neuroscience as a topic, and now I get to hyper-focus on a different neuroscience topic every day, which I love. Often completely out of my background specialty, in order to figure out how to best communicate it with the outside world, which I'm able to do exceptionally quickly. Because I'm more aware of the diversity in how different people perceive and absorb information because of my own experience, I find myself good at adapting my science content to a wide range of audiences. And this also helps me in my role as a community manager in the center, where, given my history of feeling excluded from scientific spaces, I'm all the more eager to help create a safe and inclusive environment for our researchers. This brings me to part 3, which is called Not a Happy or Sad Ending. Because what I'm always afraid of more than anything when giving a presentation like this one is accidentally falling into what I call what is called the inspiration porn category. So for those of you who haven't come across this term before, let me read a little bit of Wikipedia for you. So this term, inspiration porn, is by analogy with pornography in that the material is perceived as objectifying disabled people for the benefit or gratification of the able-bodied. Inspiration porn may be seen as a form of ableism. An example of inspiration porn might be a photo of a disabled person taking part in an ordinary activity with captions targeted towards able-bodied people, such as "they didn't let their disability stop them." So in an attempt to stay away from inadvertently placing myself in this camp and to delve a little deeper into the lived experience beyond the surface level read through of the DSM criteria and how this manifests in my experience in neuroscience, I wanted to give an honest look at the reality of what being neurodivergent in neuroscience still means to me, despite being in my best case scenario of working in a role and in an environment where I can largely be myself and feel supported and accepted. So I wanted to describe what has been referred to as the burden of ADHD. And by this, I refer to associated impairments, knock-on effects, and comorbidities, which may not be an integral part to the ADHD DSM criteria per se, but which are proven to be very much correlated to the ADHD diagnosis. So I'm going to focus on just a few of these because the list is quite extensive. So the first one I wanted to mention was health. So a 2021 study from the Karolinska Institute published in the Lancet Psychiatry found that adults with ADHD are at higher risk of a wide range of physical conditions. Anecdotal evidence has demonstrated this link for quite some time, but this was the first large-scale study that really proved this. And this is what they found. So these were the strongest associations found between ADHD and physical conditions. And on top of this, other studies have highlighted that physical disorders and ailments might become chronic or exacerbated due to ADHD traits such as forgetfulness. I've included a picture there of someone who's extremely dehydrated because this is my everyday experience where I often am quite unaware of my physical condition, which means that I forget to drink and even eat for very long periods of time. Another example is that I am very hypermobile, but due to my lack of body awareness, I've tended to lean on my joints in a way that put a lot of pressure on them, which results in chronic pain, which I am currently going to physiotherapy for. So that's just 2 examples right there, but there are so many more. The second one I wanted to mention is energy. So I don't know if you know this, but a lot of neurodivergent people use the term spoons as a sort of unit of measuring energy. The spoon theory is a metaphor used to explain how people living with chronic illness, chronic pain, and disability have limited energy resources and expend more energy on everyday tasks than people without illness and disability. In spoon theory, spoons represent both the physical and mental load required to complete tasks. For example, a regular conversation between me and other neurodivergent friends will literally look like, "Hey, do you feel up for grabbing a drink later today?" And then they'll be like, "Oh, I know that we said we would, but actually I'm really low on spoons today." We possess this tailored language for describing various states of energy because maintaining and preserving energy is a massive problem for so many neurodivergent people. In addition to the extra demand on energy that ADHDers take to, for example, focus at work or complete other cognitively demanding tasks, many of us also use up a lot of energy by what we call masking. So neurodivergent masking is the act of hiding one's traits that are a part of their neurodivergence in order to fit into society. It's a form of social survival that is displayed by many neurodivergent individuals who want to appear neurotypical and avoid discrimination or stigma. So in my case, I am often constantly paying attention to how much I am stimming, which is a repetitive performance of specific physical movements or voice, like vocalizations. And, I do it, and many people do it to bring a sense of calm or just to express emotions in our way. But this is something that I actively keep an eye on in certain situations throughout the day in order to avoid stigmatization. And then to throw out one more bit of neurodivergent vocabulary, I also lose a lot of energy when I am overstimulated. So while this is also not inherent to the ADHD criteria, it appears that many neurodivergent people experience the sensory world, so sight, smell, sound, in a different way to those who do not identify as neurodivergent. So for me, I'm mostly affected by sound. I find it hard to filter environments with inconsistent noises, and they tend to hit me with the same levels of grating intensity. This can be disorienting, making it difficult to tune in to what I'm meant to be tuning into. For example, a conversation with the person right in front of me in an environment like a busy cafeteria, for example. This can also be incredibly stressful and draining. To counter sonically unpredictable environments, I often use loops, earplugs, or headphones with white noise, or I just simply avoid busy environments. All in all, these intense demands on energy can often lead to neurodivergent burnout. To understand neurodivergent burnout, I would highly recommend reading the 2020 paper by Raymaker et al., which is called Having All Your Internal Resources Exhausted Beyond Measure and Being Left with No Cleanup Crew. I'm sorry I didn't put that on the presentation, but maybe I can drop it in the chat later. I remember this as being the first publication I ever read that was written by researchers who identify as being autistic, which I found incredibly relevant and relatable at the time. And the third element of ADHD burnout that I wanted to point out a little bit is what I call ADHD tax. So the cost of ADHD in regards to time and money. And as a somewhat humorous example of ADHD tax, I sometimes show people this photo I took of my collection of adapter plugs. I'm British, and most times I travel to the UK, I forget to bring one of my collection with me, even though I have plenty, and I end up buying another one in the airport. And the worst part is I also forget that my mum has a collection of mine at her house of almost exactly the same size. The good news is that by talking about this so much, I did actually remember to bring one of these plugs with me when I last traveled to the UK a few weeks ago, so that was great. But, in all seriousness, though, I couldn't relocate the statistic, but I did read on LinkedIn the other day that ADHD tax costs the average ADHDer about $1,500 per year, which can include things like in the list that I included here. So fees for late bills, replacing lost items, repairing costs for accidents, takeout when you forget to buy groceries and it's too late because you're not aware of your body, and then your hunger signals go off at like 11 p.m. or you think you have food in the fridge, but then you realize that it's been there for ages and it's gone off, things like that. And these things just add up in terms of finances, as you can see here, but also in terms of energy again, and time and other valuable resources. As well as avoiding the inspiration porn trope, I also wanted to avoid the sad ending trope. As both a neurodivergent person and a queer person, or a person from the LGBTQ plus community, I experienced this in double, seeing myself reflected in books or movies that conclude on a tragic note, perhaps driven by how tragic our existence can sometimes be perceived by society. So I will be concluding part 3, not a happy or a sad ending, with 2 positive things to end on. This is where I'm going off script because I ran out of time to prepare, so bear with me. But this is This is Neuro Art Exhibition, which Donna mentioned a little bit at the beginning. So I started a project stemming from my experience of being a neurodivergent person in neuroscience, a project that paired neurodivergent artists with neuroscientists at King's College London and resulted in collaborative artwork pieces that were displayed at an exhibition at Science Gallery London earlier this year, and an event which included things like a panel discussion and other interactive activities to try and bridge the gap between these two communities and start a dialogue about the value of lived experience informing research that matters, and also informing, an awareness for accessibility for neurodivergent researchers in academia as well. And my second positive note is that I actually have managed to, since my diagnosis, generate a lot of what I call neuroqueer pride. So pride at the intersection of queerness and neurodiversity, and which gives me endless amounts of joy and enjoyment. So, that's the positive note to end on. So thank you so much, and I'm more than happy to take some questions as well.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. So just to get the question period underway, one question that I had was about the fact of like getting a diagnosis at age 25. And I think a lot of people with a lot of different conditions, particularly neurodivergent conditions, tend to receive these, kind of, I guess, diagnoses or kind of more insight into what's kind of going on for them sort of later, in life. And I wondered about, the kind of, I guess, the challenges that, if you experienced any challenges to your identity as a scientist through that, because you were already sort of, on your way of kind of being in this kind of research environment, or, ways in which it did it change ways in which you worked or give you kind of insights into, various aspects of your work?
Yeah, so when I was diagnosed with ADHD and I was still working in a neuroscientific research environment, it did make me become more aware of the fact that a lot of research is driven by people who do not have lived experience of the conditions or the diagnoses or the what have you, whatever you want to call them. And yeah, that was something that really struck me after being diagnosed, and something that I was never truly aware of before. The kinds of language that was used in introductions to papers about autism, for example, or in grant applications, where the sort of narrative was, autism is a devastating disorder, and we are working towards developing a cure for this. And sort of the contrast between that kind of language that I was all of a sudden noticing with a lot more intensity, and then comparing that to the sort of neuroqueer pride that I was experiencing in the neurodivergent community, that was very, there was a lot of dissonance in my head, I think, comparing those two things. And so the way that it transformed my research practice after that is I became a lot more interested in lived experience researchers and involving lived experience experts in driving and designing from the very beginning research and the research agenda, and then also being involved in every step of the way. As I mentioned in the talk, that's why I remember just being so excited for seeing that paper by Raymaker et al., because I hadn't seen that before. And sort of from then, I've tried to be a bit more involved in research that has taken that approach. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, just to let people know, if you have questions or comments for Bethan, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I do have a follow-up to that, to your answer there. So, I think that's a really interesting insight, where you become, when, you sort of become very aware of the narrative that's sort of put forward in science. And, some of this, of course, is, I think, driven by the biomedical sort of research environment, in terms of, like, if you're going to get funding, you have to demonstrate that this condition is a problem. And so then we need money in order to do this research to help better, people's lives or whatever. So there really is this kind of almost emphasis that's like, it's so hard to break this. I don't know how we kind of change that, right? Until, like, kind of funding models and things change as well. I think that's definitely one thing. But yeah, I actually really empathize with this idea of, like, so I have major depressive disorder and have been working in looking at depression, and it's almost like I take on personally what I read. I have this personal reaction where it's kind of like I'm almost like a case study or something. You know what I mean? Like, it feels kind of negative in a way as well. And for me, it's kind of been this wanting to distance myself from that kind of research, to move away from that. And I wonder if you've had any sorts of feelings or experiences along that kind of line. I guess kind of moving into more lived experience is sort of one way of kind of dealing with that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know plenty of people who are neurodivergent and they work within the realms of science, which, as you mentioned, there's certain things about the culture and the way that funding and publishing is set up, where these things are not by any means going to change overnight. And, part of my personal decision was to move away from that, because I couldn't see myself sort of existing in an authentic sense within that framework. But yeah, no, of course, like, big props to the people who are still in the system and are sort of working to dismantle it bit by bit from the inside. I think, that's very brave of you and other people like you.
Yeah, definitely.
We have two questions in the chat. We have one from Karen, just asking for you to remind the name of the paper you mentioned. Probably you can write it on the
Yes, I can write it. I can't write it as I'm speaking, but I can do it later, or we can send a follow-up email or something. Yeah.
Okay, and then from an anonymous attendee, we also have actually two questions. So thank you for mentioning the ADHD text. One area of academia I'm aware of being a problem is travel for conferences, where neurodivergent people often end up booking late due to overload with the overlay complicated booking systems. Do you have any advice for neurodivergent people on how to do this better?
Yeah. This is a big problem in general. It comes under the umbrella of admin, which is something that I find extremely difficult as an ADHDer, and a lot of other people in my shoes too as well. I often get the complaint if I miss something like this, which is, oh, we sent an email, so sort of therefore it is assumed that that has been dealt with. So, I think maybe some grace, or I think reminders are always a great idea. For this panel discussion, I had about 5 reminders leading up to it, so that was no issue whatsoever. And I think getting into a culture of that is a very nice and graceful idea. But other than that, unfortunately, people with ADHD don't really have much access to support when it comes to admin in any sense, both professionally and personally. So yeah, this is just a matter of sort of awareness for different neurotypes, I think, and trying to design the system in a way that is a bit more accessible, whether that is putting reminders in different colors to sort of make them jump out a little bit more to ADHD brains and things like that.
Actually, I'm going to move the subject, and I'll turn to the second question from this attendee, because I actually found many similarities with me when you were describing ADHD. So, and you also mentioned, of course, there is a lot of misdiagnosis, misdiagnosing in that field. What is your advice on that? So how can we be well diagnosed for one hand, and for the second hand, how the life is going to change? You mentioned already some of that, right? But do you think it's really important, right, to be diagnosed?
So this is a very case by case question, and it's very personal, and the answer will really, really differ depending on the person and the person's experiences. One of the reasons that I decided to choose the term neurodivergent rather than ADHD is that while I have ADHD traits, I recognize that they do overlap with a lot of other conditions, including, for example, in AFAB people, CPTSD looks very, very similar, for example, to adult ADHD presentation. So for me personally, it is enough to recognize that I have specific traits, and this allows me this recognition and the sort of the vocabulary and the language and the community of people who are aware and gracious and supportive, the neurodivergent community primarily, you know, sort of is enough for me in terms of knowing that about myself and how to navigate that. I think a big reason, there's a few big reasons though why someone would want to seek a diagnosis. For ADHD, it might be medication. So a diagnosis might be necessary in order to get the kind of help that a person needs if they want to go down the medication route. And as I mentioned before, there's some diagnoses where it might be useful to have the official sort of stamp in order to get other kinds of medical or governmental support. So yeah, there's lots of reasons why a person might want to get a diagnosis or not. Some people also seek diagnosis as a kind of a validation for who they are and how they experience the world as well, which is completely valid. But you know, psychiatry is a science, but it's also sort of an art, and yeah, you know, it's not easy, sort of, and it's a long road. It's a long road, sort of navigating it and trying to understand your diagnosis.
But it's not easy to diagnose, right? So what would be the first steps for someone who feels that they might have ADHD? What do you recommend? To search what kind of doctors? Because
right. Yeah, so this will change from country to country, and I can't sort of explain that for everyone, but the usual first point of contact might be a GP, a general practitioner or family doctor. Of course, you know, that also comes with a lot of privilege. Often people have to be very lucky to have a good GP who will, you know, truly listen to their experiences and take them seriously without medical gaslighting and things like that. So but if you have a good one, if you're lucky, then that would be the first point of call, and then you would be referred to some kind of ADHD clinic or something like that. Yeah. But as I said before, you know, often if you go that route, there might be waiting lists, and it might also be worth sort of directly contacting a ADHD center to see if you can bypass some of the waiting time if you have that option.
Okay, thank you so much. Then going back to the final part of the question that an anonymous attendee put. So also for supervisors and university staff, for how to make the system better support neurodivergent people. What do you think on that?
So in a general sense, something that I haven't seen a lot is institutes, or anyone for that matter, asking for accommodation, asking for requested accommodations. This could be something that is integrated into the hiring process, for example, as part of a form, or any other kind of onboarding. Whenever there's our events, there can be a space to request accommodations for that as well. So this is just something that even on a basic level, I haven't really seen implemented, and that would be a great start, because Yes, there should be a push to accessible design, as I mentioned earlier, sort of creating spaces with accessibility in mind, which not only benefits neurodivergent and disabled people, but mostly is just better design in general and benefits everyone. But in terms of accommodations, the best point of call is just asking someone directly what they need, because they're going to know their needs best. There's no point in giving everyone extra time or everyone this or that, because these accommodations won't work the same way for everybody. So if that space, that culture, and the option to ask can be facilitated, I think that's already going to be a very good start.
Okay, thank you so much. So
should I move on to one of the next questions? Just kind of following up on that, actually, is, like you mentioned in your talk, when you have to request accommodations, you out yourself by, doing that. And one of the attendees has a question here. They say, you mentioned that you disclosed your diagnosis to your team when you started off. Any tips on how to decide when and who to tell about your diagnosis? The person's in the process of applying for PhDs and torn about being open or keeping it to themselves.
Yeah. Again, I mean, I'm going to give this disclaimer for everything, but this is obviously such a case-by-case situation. The unfortunate reality is that a lot of people are going to be, biased and might have a stigmatizing or discriminatory approach if you do decide to out yourself. On the flip side, I came to the conclusion when I was looking for jobs the last time that I don't want to be in an environment that would be reacting in that way to me outing myself. And so this was a bit of a screen test for me to see if this new working environment would be, accepting of my neurodiversity. At the same time, I also recognize that it does come with some privilege, or a lot of privilege, to be able to, screen in that way as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a mixed answer, but that's what I see. And then, was there any tips on how to decide when and who to tell about ADHD diagnosis in general? Yeah, I think this has gone on a bit of a journey for me. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I told everyone. It was such a relief, and I was so relieved to finally have an excuse or a reason behind being the way that I was, where in the past I had a lot of shame and embarrassment attached to that, and I never had a reason for being that way. So for soon after my diagnosis, it was really liberating to be able to tell people that I am diagnosed with ADHD. But then the journey flipped a little bit, where I got to this point of like, actually, do I need to give people a reason, or can I just act this way and people accept me or they don't accept me? So, it sort of has gone on a bit of a journey with that. Now I don't tend to tell people, but sometimes I do, because it's nice to sort of find other neurodivergent people. And sometimes the best way of doing that is just being very loud about it.
We also we must have a role in to be more inclusive, to spread, right, the word and talk more about it, and so on. Of course, that we must be prepared and ready, and it depends on the case, like you said. It depends on our experience, and we have to feel comfortable to do that.
Yeah.
But if we do feel comfortable, it's good, because we want to become it not subject, right? We want to talk about it, and we want to say what are the struggles and how can we overcome them.
Yeah, so, and to normalize that conversation and that experience, right, without it becoming a big thing. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So it's already. I also have another one. It's just like You told about the neurodiversity paradigm, and you told that there were two definitions, one the medical one and the social one. And I wanted you to just elaborate more on that. What is the most appropriate, on your opinion, or it's a fusion of both?
Yeah, everyone will have their own opinion. I think it's, for me, I'm a bit of a gray area person in general, and for me, it would fall somewhere in the middle. Sort of recognizing, that there are aspects to the ADHD experience that are difficult and are, sort of, let's say if everything in the environment were completely accessible and barrier free, I feel like there would still be some aspects of my experience which I would struggle with. At the same time, I have directly experienced being in very neuroqueer supportive environments, and how much that fosters my capacity to be myself and feel absolutely no shame about it. So yeah, I think a sort of a two-way approach and somewhere in the middle is what I would think of there.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there are no more questions in the Q&A, right?
No, I think we're good. So yeah, so Bethan, we'd just really like to thank you for joining us today and being part of this webinar series, and really, sharing your lived experience with us, both the good and the bad, and really kind of getting into some of the nuances of this. So thank you so much for that.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you again.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.